So here I'm getting pretty much launched into the air, basically. So yeah, this is kind of the result of trying to do two things at the same time, different things with your feet that you're not used to. Hi fellow inline pilots, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to my Beginner to Powerslide series. This is part 4. This series is a way of me to share the steps that I went through as a beginner, starting inline skating almost 2 years ago and trying to learn the Powerslide. So it's not actually a tutorial, it's in the sense of showing you this is how it should be done, because I'm not an expert on skating yet, if I will ever be, and I don't want to say I don't know if this is the perfect way to do it, the way that I eventually came to do it, but I just want to share the challenges that I went through, which I think it's useful anyway, even for other people to see, because often teachers, they are already skating for a long time and they kind of forgot about the challenges that they had to go through to learn it, and I still have them fresh in my memory, and I've got some videos about it, so I'm really eager to share like things that I recorded from my progress and things that I experienced, because I learned a lot from it, also looking back in my own videos, so maybe also other people can learn from it. So in the first episode I kind of covered other braking methods as well as the Powerslide, to share kind of a comparison and give an overview and explain why I decided I wanted to learn the Powerslide as opposed to other braking methods. Then in the second episode I focused on the basic skills you need to do a Powerslide as simple as possible, which is just going backwards, then being able to glide on one foot so you can extend the other foot and do a Powerslide. And then in the third episode I showed the way to jump from forwards to backwards into the Powerslide. And now this fourth episode I'm going to discuss the lunge turn entry. And the lunge turn entry is actually kind of the most well-known way. When people think about a Powerslide, they usually think about doing this lunge turn entry, even though it's not the only way. And the way that it works is that you pivot around one foot, which will become the foot that goes backwards, and then you swing the other foot around and that will become the sliding foot. So you do at the same time a transition into the slide and a turnaround from forwards to backwards. So for me it was quite challenging to learn this one, so I started first with the jump entry, but I almost gave up on this because all the other videos that I've watched on YouTube were recommending things that didn't work for me. They were saying things like you should kind of turn like sharper and sharper, and until you go so sharp that you will slide. And that didn't seem to work for me, and I found out later why, and why it's a good idea actually not to do that, because for me it would have been a disaster. Because if you slide on your outside foot but you didn't learn how to turn around the other foot, then you'll get into a split and maybe pull a muscle or worse. So I think that was really bad advice, and yeah, eventually I found another way, which I'm going to share. And even a second way that I also used for refining my skills, which might be also another way to learn it for the first time, I don't know, because that was not the way that I learned it. So yeah, let's get into it. I'm really eager to share this, so I hope you can learn from it and enjoy the whole episode, even though it's going to take a little bit of a long time to explain everything. Literally, this episode has been years in the making, because I've been recording these fragments for like the past 1.5 years, and I've collected all of them in one video here to share. So yeah, enjoy. But before we get into the Powerslide, I first want to share a correction on a video I did about the comparison between the decode bearing and another normal bearing, the Wicked bearing, the ABEC 9. In that video I shared how my wheels were not turning very well with the decode bearings after I assembled them, the wheels. And my comments were that I thought probably it's because there's grease in there, not oil, and the grease was a little bit, if it's cold, it's a little bit too viscous to turn the wheels very well. Actually, I think there was another reason in this case why my wheels were not turning, which I actually mentioned in the video where I assembled the wheels. It's a much longer video, which is that the spacers were a bit larger than the hubs of the wheel. And I was pressing the bearings on the outer ring into the wheel, and therefore the spacer was pressing the inner races of the bearings outwards, and that gives a little bit of a tension between the outer ring and the inner ring of the bearing. It's quite common after you assemble your wheels, because spacers are sometimes a little bit too large, which is better than if they're too small. Because if they're too small, the short spacers will cause the bearing to be under tension when you tension your wheel. While in this case, because it was only a tension because I pushed the outer race in further than the inner race, after I skated for a couple of minutes, the wheels, the bearings settled themselves, and then, as you can see here, then after a couple of minutes skating, the wheels were turning quite fine. So I think it was not really because of the grease that was warming up, but I think it was more about the bearing needs to align after you skate a little bit. Anyway, so in the meantime I got a set of spacers that have different lengths, which I can experiment with, but it's not really a big problem. It's just that if the spacer is too large, sometimes the wheel can make some noise when it shifts along the bearings, but it's not a really big problem. It's more like an annoyance, but I just want to make things perfect as much as I can. Anyway, I wanted to correct that. So without further ado, let's get back to the lunge turn entry into the Powerslide. So for me, the main reason I found that I couldn't learn the lunge turn entry was because the lunge turn entry into the Powerslide means you're doing two different things with both feet at the same time. The timing is really important. And they were both things that I didn't know how to do yet. And it's very difficult to learn two things at the same time, try out two new things at the same time with both feet in a different way. And for me, especially, this is really impossible. I mean, I think it's difficult for everybody, but for me, it's just out of the question. So I've had to find a way to start doing a Powerslide, lunge turn entry, without having to think about both feet at the same time, to be able to focus on only one foot at a time, and still be able to do the motion where I have to have both feet doing something in a different way. So the way that I found worked for me is what I call the S.L.O.W method. So in the S.L.O.W method, I'm setting up my front foot before starting the lunge turn. And I call it slow because I'm putting my front foot in slow mode. And slow stands for stiff ankle. So I keep my front ankle very stiff so it will not move. And the L stands for low, so you have to keep as low as possible, which is not easy because I also found that I have to, for me it worked best to keep the other foot behind as much as possible, like keeping my feet not just in a scissors position, but actually in a kind of a sequence position where I've got them both behind each other. So keeping low at that position is quite difficult, but as low as possible. And then the O stands for the outside edge, so that's really important. So I was leaning, as you can see, I'm leaning my foot sideways as much as possible on the outside edge, and then keeping the ankle stiff at that position. So I do all of this before I'm starting the lunge turn. So I'm just going straight and put the foot in slow mode, and then put the other foot behind me. And when I then go into a turn, I keep my ankle stiff, I keep the foot as it is, so I don't have to think about it anymore. That's the whole thing, that's the whole method that works for me. So once I put it in slow mode, that front foot, I don't need to worry about it anymore. I just need to keep it at the same angle towards myself if I do the turn. And if I eventually go into a pivot, I keep my ankle stiff so that the foot keeps pointing away from me, and the ankle, my heel keeps following my center of my body. So it will turn with me and it doesn't stay behind. It's quite important. Otherwise, I have some examples where that didn't work very well, but if I keep my ankle stiff enough, then that should work. So then, so after I set it up, I will go into a turn, and then during the turn I will kind of let go. Oh, sorry, I forgot about the most important part is the W, which stands for keeping my weight on the front foot. So this is really important. This is kind of what it makes a lunge turn instead of a parallel turn. Because in a parallel turn you kind of put more weight on the outside back foot or equal weight, but in a lunge turn you put most of your weight on the front foot, and I targeted like 99%, even though it's maybe not necessary to be 99% of your weight on one foot. But if you go for 99%, you probably end up with 80%, which is probably about the kind of weight distribution that you want. Because the outside foot that's going to go outside and slide, that needs to be quite light in order to get into the slide. And so putting that weight on that front foot is the only way that it will work. So once I get into the turn, then I will kind of first keep my back foot behind me, and then I suddenly let go of my back foot and I kind of swing it out around my body. And then once I swing it out, I get that momentum that swinging foot gives me will increase the turn sharpness. So the sharpness of the turn will not increase before I swing my foot, it will be increasing because I swing out my foot, my back leg. So that swinging out of the back leg feels a bit like, because it's kind of very light, it's kind of swinging out like swinging out a broom that swings past me, and it's just gliding over the floor. So it's not really rolling, and it's not even really sliding. It's more like just like how do you say, brushing the floor as light as possible. And then once you go around, then you can get into the slide if you want. But you can also keep the weight on that pivoting foot. But at least this is kind of a beginning. So it's not going to be a perfect power slide. But for me, this was really like the key that got me into the motion. So I can start focusing on this sliding foot and the way that I swing it out, the angle, the timing with the turn, and then swing it out and get that motion, get a feeling for how that motion of that swinging leg is pulling my whole body around. Without having to think about this pivoting leg. So just focusing on one leg at a time, that's the whole key of this method that worked for me. So as I said, this exercise allows me to focus on mostly the sliding leg, and besides the fact that you want it to be light, which is why you put most of the weight on that front foot, one other thing that you want to pay attention to is that you're sliding it on the heel. In the beginning I thought, because I wanted to be lower, I thought, well, maybe if I can, one way to be lower is, if you put all the weight on your front foot, is to kind of do a toe roll on the back foot, then you can go lower on the front leg. And that was not a good idea at all. When I did that, I almost fell down when I went into the slide, because you really shouldn't put any weight on that front wheel of the sliding foot. It really needs to be on the back wheel. And this is also another thing that differs between the 2 feet, because I will explain later. Actually, on the pivoting foot, you want to put the weight on the front wheel, while on the sliding foot, you want to put the weight on the back wheel. So that's kind of the opposite between each other. Though it makes sense from a turning perspective. When you do a 2-foot turn, normally you also put the weight on the foot that goes backwards on the front, and the foot that goes forwards, you want to put the weight on the back wheel. So in that sense, it's kind of consistent with that. But if you're not used to doing that, then you also have to kind of do 2 things that differently between the 2 feet in that sense. So yeah, that's something that in the beginning I needed to pay attention to really slide on the back side of the foot and not the front, and also not the middle, but mostly on the back wheel. Even if this doesn't really result in a perfect lunge entry power slide, actually there's another advantage of this this exercise, which is because you keep that pivoting foot stiff. It's kind of also a sort of a start of a power stop, because in the power stop you don't actually pivot your foot around. You actually keep it in a 90-degree angle to your motion, as if you're going to do a parallel slide, sort of. And that's also when you need strength on that foot. You need to keep it stiff. You need to keep holding it against the ground so that it will slide eventually. So actually, learning the Powerslide lunge turn entry is also sort of a kind of a preparation for the power stop. Although it will take a long time for me to be able to do a proper power stop, but it's kind of related. So I think it's also a nice exercise to learn the power stop eventually. And one more trick that I did for me to actually put that weight on that front leg, which is one of the biggest challenges as a beginner, as I also found out. Just that lunge turn is kind of a really new way of turning, putting that weight on that inside foot, which is a bit counter-intuitive, because I always thought intuitively that putting my weight on the outside foot in a turn is safer, because if I keep that inside as sort of like a spare leg, when the outside foot would slide out, then I can always catch myself on the inside leg. But if I use my inside leg for turning, and if that would slip out, there's nothing left to keep me standing. So it's kind of like feels very risky to do. So it's kind of getting your mind to do it, because it's actually not as dangerous as you would think in the beginning, because the wheels really have a lot of grip, and even if you slide, it's not going to be the worst way of falling. Usually you kind of fall on your side, and then you're already low to the ground, especially if you're doing it properly. You're going low, and then you're going to go into the lunge turn. So it's kind of getting your mind to get used to the feeling of putting your weight on that front inside foot. And one way for me to learn that better is to put my weight with my to help me put my weight on it by putting my hands on my knee. So just like I was preparing my front foot in slow mode, I would also put my hands on my knee at the same time. Just gives it a bit more strength, feels like, and a little bit more support. But it's also kind of a mental thing, like you have to remind yourself to put that weight on there, and be sure that you do it, because sometimes you think you're putting the weight on there, but it's not actually on that foot, or maybe not as much as it should be. So just putting those hands on the knee, even if it doesn't physically give a lot of support, it's also kind of a mental support for me that helped for me to get the weight on that front foot and go into the lunge turn. So maybe it's an idea that will work for you as well. I don't know. At least it helped me. As I said before, this slow mode method is not really the perfect way to do a lunge to entry power slide. Eventually you want to make an easier pivot of the foot. And the way to do that is to actually put your weight on the front of the foot, as far as I understand. So I could say it's kind of an extension of the S.L.O.W method. Let's call it the slow toe method, where you don't just put your weight on that front foot, put it on the outside edge, but you also try to put your weight, most of it, on the front wheel, and try to maybe lift up your heel a little bit when you make the turn. And that will make the pivot much easier, and then you don't risk getting stuck, as I will show later. I did in the beginning a lot. So eventually, when you're ready to kind of focus a little bit more on that pivoting foot, if you kind of feel a bit more comfortable with that sliding foot, then start focusing on that toe pivot. I think that's one way to progress. In the last episode about jump transition into the power slide, I said that I didn't know a way to practice the lunge turn entry into the power slide without actually sliding and wearing down your wheels. But the advantage apparently of taking such a long time before making this episode is that in the meantime I found a way, seems like, that will help learning the lunge turn entry without actually sliding. And besides that, it's also, I think, a good way to just kind of practice the lunge turn entry and get a bit more skill and focus on that pivoting foot as well. And what I call it is the stretched lunge turn. And the stretched lunge turn is a way where I try to extend my outside foot in the lunge turn as much as possible. So I started with like doing crossovers and then trying to make the outside leg before pushing under with the other foot, putting the outside leg really far away. And then in the beginning it's a bit difficult to balance. It takes a bit of practice, but eventually I was able to extend that outside so far that I could actually touch the ground with my boot. So that was really I could turn in a way that I was going as low as possible, so I could actually make a slide, but I wasn't actually sliding because I was still turning on the inside foot with practically all of my weight on it. And the thing about this is that you really have to learn how to place that inside foot underneath, put all your weight on it, and it has to kind of tilt outwards so that all the weight and also the force of the rotation that you're countering is kind of going straight into the ground. So even though you're holding your foot kind of leaning to the inside of the turn, the force is actually going straight in the ground. So you don't want to have it your knee is next to your chest if you go low enough, but you're not actually you shouldn't be feeling any pull to the side of your skate. Your skate should feel like it's kind of pointing straight into the ground, and that is really the technique you have to kind of practice. But at least it's something you can practice without focusing on that outside foot, because the outside foot is not sliding, it's just going outside, and you don't have to think about it. So kind of the opposite way of the S.L.O.W method, where you could focus on the outside foot, didn't have to think about the inside foot. Here you can actually think about the inside pivoting, or it's not really pivoting yet, but that inside foot without having to think about that sliding foot. And then once you get into a turn, and you can make that turn in a reasonable speed, all you have to do to turn it into a slide is just lift up your heel. Because if you lift up your heel on that foot where you put most of your weight on, it will automatically pivot because you're being pulled to the outside of the turn. And also it's very nice if that it kind of feels a bit safe, because if it doesn't work, if you don't go into slide, what happens is your foot will pivot, but it will turn around as if you're doing a Mohawk transition. So if you can do a Mohawk transition, this method will not feel very scary, because if you don't get into a slide, you would just get into a Mohawk turn and you would just turn around. And so for me, I think that would be another way that I could have learned the Powerslide. I'm not sure, the lunge turn entry, I mean. I'm not sure if this would have helped me to learn it for the first time, but it seems that it could work for somebody else, maybe, if you want to try it. I think it's a good way, and also it's like, it feels a bit more proper technique for me. I think this is more like you can learn the real stance that you need to get into the Powerslide from the lunge turn. And also very important is you're training the leg and that balance, which is very important to put it on the inside leg. So I still keep doing this exercise sometimes. And the nice thing is, because it's kind of, you don't have to go into slide, you can go back and pull your outside leg back and doing the crossover. And that means that you're getting a little bit speed again. So you can keep turning in eights, keep repeating this exercise without actually stopping, without sliding, without wearing down your wheels. But the only problem is that it's very, very tough on my legs, so I didn't really have the strength to do it in the beginning. And as you can see in the video, I really have trouble at the end when I'm getting tired to even get up again on that leg. And at some point I actually couldn't get up anymore, and I just had to kind of drop to the ground because my leg was just exhausted. So I think it's a really good exercise for balance, for the technique you need to learn for the Powerslide, and also for the lunge turn, and also gain that muscle strength, which eventually might have also helped to do the power stop, and also to do a parallel slide. And also I think this is kind of a way I also try it sometimes at higher speed to make a very sharp turn. If I get the balance right and my leg is not completely tired, it's actually it feels like a safe way to turn, because you put your foot kind of straight underneath you instead of beyond your center. So if you would slide with that inside foot, having that outside foot all stretched out, you could actually go into a slide without falling. So you could just slide sideways. That's another thing that I like about this. When you actually go into the Powerslide from this method, lifting up that heel and then sliding out from the turn, it kind of feels like you're going sideways instead of backwards. So it feels a bit of less of a shock than turning around and sliding backwards. So it's kind of I think it's quite a gentle way to get into the lunge turn entry for the Powerslide. So I think it's a good idea to do this as a beginner, but as I said, I didn't do this as my first way to do it, so I can't really say if this would be working without having done the slow method at all. But anyway, I think it's a good exercise. Okay, we need to talk, because I've been having some problems. I mean, I had some problems with the lunge turn entry. So let's talk about them, because I think it's good to talk about problems sometimes. So I had 3 problems, basically. They can be divided mainly in 3. So let's get into those and see what we can learn from them. I learned a lot from it. So the first one is kind of the most obvious one that you find also probably when you start learning it, which is not going low enough. And if you don't go low enough, you don't get into a slide. If you don't get into the slide, what happens is that you will just turn. So yeah, that's kind of the first problem I had. And then the second one, I think it's a bit more difficult for me. It was at least. And the two are kind of related. So the second problem is that as I told about the slow method, I keep my front pivoting foot stiff, and then hopefully it will turn around with me. But sometimes, because in the beginning I wasn't really focusing on that foot, so I wasn't really lifting up the heel at all. I was just keeping it static on the ground, on the outside edge, hopefully. But sometimes I didn't keep my ankle stiff enough, or I had too much friction on the wheels, and the heel would stay behind. It will not turn with me. It will not keep pointing at me. And what happens then is the same thing that I would think would have happened if I would have followed the main advice of other people that I heard about learning the lunge entry. to the Powerslide, which is to try to turn as fast as possible, keep increasing your turning angle until you start sliding. But if you don't turn that pivoting foot around, this is what happens. So you can see that, yeah, it's just not going, it's going sideways, the other foot, instead of following you. So I had these two problems, and the thing is that for me, if I focused on one, I would say, okay, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be low enough to slide. So I would focus on my sliding leg, but then I got the pivoting problem on the other leg. But if I would then focus on my pivoting leg and say, okay, now I'm going to do a proper 180 pivots, I'm sure I'm going to pivot now, then I would have problems not being low enough to slide because I'm not focusing on that sliding leg anymore. And then, of course, you can also have both at the same time. And then disaster happens. So yeah, that was kind of my main frustration learning the Powerslide. But there was another problem actually. So here I'm getting pretty much launched into the air basically. So yeah, this is kind of the result of trying to do two things at the same time, different things with your feet that you're not used to, and then trying to spread my attention to both and not spreading my attention too much, and then not focusing as much as I need to on either foot. So anyway, that was kind of a challenge, but as I said before, just doing those exercises, first the slow method and then also the stretch lunge turn, if you kind of learn both the pivot and the slide, eventually you can get over this in that way. Just try to do one thing at a time. For me, that was the best way to do it. Anyway, so when I even when I got that, I still had a third problem, which had a couple of times, and for a long time I wasn't really sure what the problem was caused by, and it would cause me to fall most of the time. Actually, I can remember only maybe 1 or 2 times where it happened almost and I didn't fall, but most of the time, like 80% of the time, I would just fall down. So let me first just show what it looks like. So it feels like my pivoting leg is just weak and just doesn't have any weight on it or something, and it just like disappears underneath me. So I think what happens here is that I'm not just putting it at the right place underneath my weight. So I'm putting it a bit too far behind me, I think. But it's quite can be quite a tricky result. So sometimes I'm kind of doing some awkward, ending up with my legs a bit awkward. So yeah, it was a bit scary, I think, for me, because it was happening so unexpectedly. And even after a long time, when I thought I kind of started to become a bit more comfortable with the Powerslide lunge turn entry, suddenly this just happened out of nowhere. So, but I think I kind of understand now. It's kind of having to do with the placement of my foot underneath, and I think it's probably going to be improving by learning, practicing that stretch lunge turn, where I place that inside foot underneath my weight at the right place. So I think this is going to help me. I'm not sure. I'm still in progress of perfecting. It may happen again in the future, because I thought I was like over it, and then suddenly it happened again not too long ago. So yeah, I can't really be sure that this is going to help. But I think getting that weight, feeling for placement of that pivoting foot, dropping down in a right way, low enough, I think it's going to help preventing all those problems that I'm showing here. whenever I'm practicing something and trying to consolidate my learning by repeating over and over again, I'm always looking to find ways to put the exercise or the motion, the maneuver or whatever into a routine. That way I can keep on going in a flow. And I've been trying to do that with the Powerslide lunge turn entry as well. And the first first period, I was having problems that after I did the lunge turn entry into the Powerslide, I would end up backwards. And then I didn't find that there was a good way to turn back forwards that would feel right for me. If, like, I wanted to be a bit more flowy, and the only way to turn back forwards that I knew of was doing a Mohawk turn or 180, which is kind of like lifting your foot or lifting both feet off the ground. And well, I found that lunge turn entry feels like a nice flow into a slide and then turning backwards. It kind of feels like a sort of a wizardy kind of move. And I wanted to keep that motion, that flow going and keep repeating, but I didn't know a good way to turn forwards. So then I realized that there's a way to turn forwards from backwards without lifting up your feet, and it's called the inverted Mohawk turn. So I wanted to learn that just because I think I wanted to use it for so this is the inverted Mohawk, where you kind of pivot on the heel and then turn from backwards to forwards, kind of sliding, pivoting on the heel. So I was just practicing this mainly to get into a routine for learning the Powerslide, but also I already saw people doing the inverted Mohawk, like Esha from Skate Fresh, and some other people doing kind of a more like a grapevine kind of flow, which also seems to me like an inverted Mohawk. And I wanted to learn that anyway because I thought it really looked cool, and I thought, well, if I wanted to learn it anyway, and it's also going to help me learn the Powerslide, then let's learn it now. That's a good time. I thought it was the best time to start learning that. And also, I was getting a bit bored just learning the Powerslide, so it's kind of a good variation of my practices. So yeah, I learned that, and in the beginning, this was a bit. Okay, this is kind of the thing the end result that I wanted. And this is how I started at first. So I first did a kind of a step over, and it's sort of like a controlled falling. I just put my leg, because it's kind of an unnatural way of turning when you're used to doing the Mohawk turn, opening up your legs. You're actually doing the opposite direction. It feels like you shouldn't be doing that. So I first kind of did it like I was just stepping over, and I thought, well, if I just turn my body and I would step over, I would eventually end up probably with my foot on the ground in the right direction, and I would catch myself and then get the other way, the other leg behind me. And then eventually I mastered the inverted Mohawk, and I felt more comfortable, so then I could actually incorporate it, went back to my learning of the Powerslide lunge turn entry. And then actually I took it a bit further. I also wanted to do a little bit more of a grapevine way. But anyway, so what I found out is that not only could I use the inverted Mohawk to turn back forwards in a more flowy way, I found out actually when you do the lunge turn entry, you slide with that leg out. If you keep that weight on the pivoting foot, you can actually pull that sliding foot back inwards and turn it all the way around as an inverted Mohawk. So I would actually not just go do a lunge turn entry in Powerslide, then go backwards, then go forwards with an inverted Mohawk. I found that I could actually combine the lunge turn Powerslide followed directly by an inverted Mohawk turn, which I found it quite fun, but it was a bit tricky because you need to keep that weight on that pivoting foot, and it's kind of a bit difficult to balance. But I had a lot of fun doing that a couple of times. So yeah, it was interesting. But yeah, I'm not sure if I learned a lot about doing the Powerslide, but at least it gave me a little bit more skills and maneuverability. And anyway, so I think it was nice to learn it. I love doing the inverted Mohawk now, as well as the, as I showed, apart from the Powerslide. So I'm really happy that I learned it, but I don't think it helped me a lot for learning the Powerslide lunge turn entry. But it kept me going, because it was getting a bit boring sometimes, just doing the Powerslide lunge turn. Anyway, so yeah, that's it basically. That's kind of one way I tried to consolidate. Another way to consolidate the lunge turn entry into the Powerslide in a bit more practical is to combine it with other exercises where you end up at the end of the road or the end of the garage in this case, and then just stop yourself using a Powerslide. For instance, I was doing slalom on one leg to increase my my maneuverability and my outside edge, my edge work, and then in the end I would do a lunge turn entry Powerslide and then go back the other direction. And it's kind of good, because in this case you're not just focused on the lunge turn entry Powerslide all the time. You kind of do something else where you focus on, and then suddenly you need to go into the lunge turn entry. And this is kind of a nice way to get this muscle memory a little bit more automatic, because you have to quickly do it instead of already thinking about it the whole time. So going from one task into the lunge turn entry and then going back to the other task. This is much more kind of like a way to train yourself and being able to do it on demand. So, for instance, I also kind of learned here trying to bit more into the double push, trying to get a bit more this outside edge turning, and then in the end stop again with the lunge turn entry Powerslide, then go back into the other direction. By the way, if you haven't noticed it already by now, I'm quite strict with myself about learning everything in both directions. There's nothing I've learned so far that I cannot do in both directions, because anything that is more difficult in one direction than the other, I would actually repeat it more in the way that it's most difficult for me, until it evens out on both sides. And for me, the reason is mainly that I find that if I learn one thing, it often gives me skills that I can also use somewhere else in another maneuver, another skill later on, and I don't want to miss out on skills that I might learn from something and only be able to do that on one side, not the other. Even though in practice the lunge turn entry into the Powerslide, I might want to use it only on one side, which is the most stable and the most predictable for me, if I really need it as a braking method. But for practice, I always use both sides. I always train most of the time the weakest side in order to balance it out. This exercise I found it most difficult to combine with a Powerslide. It's like going backwards, doing crossovers, then in the end doing kind of a backwards T-stop, and then doing the inverted Mohawk transition. After that, somehow I ended up with my balance that was kind of really different from how I would go into a Powerslide, so I found it very difficult to follow it directly by a Powerslide, which is why I like practicing this. I always think when I find something that I find difficult, I want to repeat that. I want to like make sure I get that, and that seems to me like there's a challenge that I need to go through and practice that. So anyway, that's what I repeated a couple of times until I could combine the Powerslide in the end. So yeah, whatever you're practicing, just putting a Powerslide at the end of the run and then continuing the exercise, whatever you're trying to practice, I think it's a good idea to consolidate learning a Powerslide, getting a bit more into the muscle memory. Last but not least, and a very important factor for me to learn the lunge entry into the Powerslide, and also other ways of doing the Powerslide, is to have a good environment, a safe environment and a smooth floor, which is not too grippy, but also not too slippy. so that you can get into a slide fairly easy, but you also have grip to accelerate. And I've been quite lucky to be blessed with access to a magic garage. So you've seen most of my videos coming from here. This garage is governed by the skating wizard, and the skating wizard makes sure that at the end of the day, most of the cars will be summoned away, so that I'm free to skate there. And yeah, that's quite nice. I've seen other people recommending skating when it has rained, so when the road is wet. And for me, that didn't seem to be an ideal circumstance at all, because then, for me, if it's really wet, it's too slippy to accelerate, and also it becomes unpredictable because some parts of the road will be more wet than others. There will be puddles, and it's also bad for the bearings if they get wet. And generally, it's not very nice to be outside when it might be still raining, or it might start to rain when you're trying to practice. So yeah, mostly it was just too slippy for me to practice the Powerslide. In a garage, the nice thing about it is that not just that the floor is very smooth, but also, even though I'm sweeping the floor, because of the sand, you don't want to have loose sand there. But even after sweeping the floor, there will be still a very thin layer of very fine dust on the floor. And this makes it so that not only is it a bit more slippy, not too grippy, but also my wheels do not wear out, because I'm actually sliding on top of the dust. As you can see here, I'm leaving behind a trail, which is not actually a skid mark. It's not leaving behind parts of my wheel or something. It's just sweeping away the dust where I'm sliding. And the dust keeps my wheels from wearing out, which is quite useful, because it's kind of like you have a cheat code where in like a computer game you can have infinite lives. It's like I've got infinite lives for my wheels here, because whenever I slide, I barely have any wear of my wheels, since this dust is doing the rubbing, and the wheels are just kept intact. And another thing for me that helped a lot in my skating practice was sweeping the floor. Actually, I had to maneuver with a broom in my hands, and that also gave me a lot of practice of making sharp turns, crossovers, etc. So yeah, it helped me a lot for my skating abilities to have this garage and to keep it clean. Of course, not everybody has access to an office garage, which is where people leave at the end of the day. But there are like parking garages everywhere around. For instance, you can find maybe a parking garage for a supermarket, or maybe another office that is open to, like the garage is open all day to enter if you want. And there might always be some parts of the garage where people don't come, like far away from the entrance. People like to park near the entrance, so sometimes there's one of the floors or one corner of the garage will be nearly empty. Maybe that's an idea to skate if you don't have access to your own office garage. On the other hand, of course, you have to be careful if you're skating at night or at a quiet area where there's nobody around. You want to be safe. Maybe if you're all alone in a garage, it can also be very unsafe. Like in Germany, there's the rule that women can park near the exit, because they might feel unsafe if they have to go through the garage. So I guess there's a reason for that, and so I don't want to encourage people to practice in an unsafe area. So please take care of that. Make sure that you're not all alone. Somewhere where people might enter who have less than well-intentioned motivations. But yeah, I think it's very important for learning the Powerslide to have this smooth floor in the beginning. Of course, in the end, you want to be learning how to slide in a more practical outside environment as well. But for the beginning, getting into the slide when you're not used to getting really, really low yet. For me, it was really helpful to have this environment. And with that, we have come to the end of part 4 of the Beginner to Powerslide series. Since you've made it all the way to the end, congratulations! Thanks for watching all the way through. Also, I think that it's good if for me, the first times I watched other people explain the lunge turn entry, there were things that I missed. So maybe it's good to watch this episode again, and maybe find other things that I've said that maybe initially you didn't catch. For instance, one thing that I missed of other people explaining the lunge turn is to put the weight on that front foot. That's really important. I found out later. Yeah, so sorry for taking so long to finish this episode. I want to. I've got a lot of other videos that I want to make. First, I wanted to finish this. For instance, I've got something about being able to do a drag T-stop, a bit more stable, how to control the sliding leg, and some other things I wish to make videos about, but I don't really have a lot of time, as I said before, so it will take a while before probably the next video comes out. Anyway, I hope to see you in the next video then, and if you like the video, you think it's useful, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps other people to see it as well, and helps me to know that it's being appreciated, and motivates me to make more videos as well, even though it takes me a lot of time. So yeah, hope to see you in the next video. Bye!